Welcome. Welcome. You are listening to audio from the table. If you'd like to learn more about our community or donate to this ministry, please visit thetabletx.com.
Grace and peace, Table Podcast listeners. Brett here. Good to be with you all. So we are currently in part 7 of 8 in our series titled Grounded, the Ethics of Jesus in a Shaky World. And the premise is basically that as religious engagement kind of fades in the culture, a kind of almost like a loss of clarity can set in. We just aren't so sure about God anymore. And because of this, we aren't really sure what the good is. We aren't sure what a good life is actually all about. We start to lose a sense of kind of a shared moral order, and then by default kind of resort to sort of a anything goes kind of vision of life success. Though a lot of people do default to something like career and money making. And I think this is a decline, and there's kind of signs of this decline all around us, from politicians and leaders who are unashamedly corrupt, to young people who equate a good life with being famous, to churches more interested in numerical growth or political power than the character and Christ-likeness of their members. So in this series, we're basically saying like, hey, let's not be that. Let's take ethics seriously. Let's think deeply about what a good life kind of looks like. Let's reflect on the teachings and person of Christ to be guided towards God in the vision of the good that he advocated. So that's what this series is all about. So with that in mind, the title of my message this week is Hospitality in Meeting the Person. And our primary scripture is Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." So the historical background of this will be familiar to many of you, but just to make sure we're kind of all on the same page, let me do a quick review. So tax collectors in the ancient world were not like IRS agents today. This wasn't like, a straightforward financial job. In Jesus' day, the Romans had conquered the Jewish people and taken control of like Jerusalem and the surrounding region. And so part of how they extracted value as the conquerors was to levy heavy taxes on those they conquered. And the way they did this was by appointing tax collectors who were often chosen from among the conquered people. Now, the trouble was that the tax collectors weren't exactly paid like a clear salary normally. They were instead paid by, or at least mostly by, whatever they could extort from the people over and above what Rome required. So this is why tax collectors were generally despised in the ancient world. They were seen as not only just like ethically unscrupulous, but really as kind of traitors to like their own people. In fact, a few quotes about tax collectors have been preserved from ancient writings, Jewish writings around this time. So this first one I'll read, this is from the Mishnah Nedarim, which says, "One may vow to murderers, robbers, or tax collectors." Now, the context here is about false vows and lies. So really when it says one may vow, it means one may falsely vow. And basically, it's like if a robber comes into your house and is like, "Hey, give me all your cash," the text is saying like, look, it's okay to be like, "I don't have any," or "over in that drawer, that's it, that's where it all is," even if that's not true. So you can kind of see, right, that these religious writings are saying, look, it's fine to mislead murderers, robbers, tax collectors. Why? Because they're the worst. They do evil, and it's not evil to mislead evil. And in fact, by misleading them, you may even be preventing, greater harm to yourself or others. Another example was the ancient Jewish historian Josephus quotes a man in his writings named Judas from Gamala, who said this taxation was no better than an introduction to slavery. Now, Judas of Gamala, not to be confused, by the way, with Judas Iscariot, betrayer of Jesus, would go on to try and start an armed revolt against Rome. But it's telling that to get the people stirred up, what does he talk about? Taxation, this unjust taxation. So, from that context, these are, context clues. We get it, right? Like, people didn't like tax collectors. They were viewed, again, morally corrupt people whom polite company pretty much ignored, certainly did not befriend. Which is why in our gospel reading today, verse 7 says, all the people saw this and began to mutter that that's Jesus, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. Now, I'll say this, the point of the sermon isn't really to focus in too much on Zacchaeus and tax collectors. Rather, the point is that this story serves as an example of a broader theme in Jesus' life, which, as we talked about last week, was, yes, a kind of divine love, but really it's more specific than that, right? It goes beyond that, because that love manifested or was expressed, among other ways, but as a kind of all-embracing hospitality and welcome. Now, most of I think we're pretty much for this, right? We love the stories of, like, Jesus healing and embracing the lepers or the despised or the poor or the destitute. We appreciate his vision of kind of refusing to treat anyone as like some sort of outcast. And, we kind of fundamentally agree with Jesus in his apparent disagreement with the reasons they were outcasts in the first place. Right? In other words, kind of our cultural vantage point, and honestly, the fact that we've been influenced by like 2,000 years of Christian culture, it does kind of give us a certain clarity on the culture of the ancient world, from which we kind of see like rejecting lepers, the poor, women, sexual minorities, and so on and so forth. Not good, not noble. So having said that, though, let me kind of press a bit here on the forms of hospitality that I do think we struggle with. So this is kind of my first point. While it's easy to speak in broad terms about, including everyone or never treating anyone as an outcast, in actual practice, like in our living, this leads to all sorts of moral conundrums and profoundly troubling places. Again, we're very much in line with our message last week about loving enemies, and so on, because it's perfectly easy to say, with the words, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Similarly, it's easy to say, embrace everyone, love without boundaries, practice a radical hospitality where no one is a stranger in your home, all are welcome. All means all, y'all. This is good. These are good sentiments. Could even, a lot of them fit on a bumper sticker. It's like, yeah, but to actually live them, I'm not even just saying it's hard. Though that's true, but I'm saying like it's tricky. Like it takes some discernment. You see, the moral difficulty, you kind of see this in this story with Zacchaeus and how his repentance functions in the story, right? It's kind of like important because I think without that, this would probably be a much less popular story. It would become a kind of, I don't know, maybe make us uncomfortable, like a weird story where Jesus is kind of like reduced to sort of helping like morally bad people, but then is he just helping them like feel better about themselves? Maybe even perpetuating their terrible actions by easing their guilty consciences? I can imagine Jesus becoming very popular among tax collectors. They might say like, oh, at least Jesus accepts us as we are. We can't help it if our work requires us to make a little extra on the side, So I think what I'm getting at here is that the church, kind of down through the millennia, as she's kind of sought to live into all this, we've kind of had to learn like some lessons. And it's true that in situations of injustice, like generally we do need to prioritize the victims and not always be quite so quick to just like jump to ensure the perpetrators also know that we love them too, Because I think at times we have been a bit naive about how people can kind of like manipulate all of this, can even manipulate forgiveness and such. So I do think progressive Christians are probably more attuned to this than your average like churchgoer. And I want to just start by saying that's good. And yet, on the other hand, maybe we progressive Christians have also swung that pendulum so hard where we're like so attuned to the cries of the victim that perhaps we can again sort of receive the prophetic critique of Jesus' actions here. Because I'll say, like, if progressive Twitter is any indication, it seems to me that progressive Christians have very little interest in sitting down for a meal with the Zacchaeuses of this world. Like, in essence, we will welcome in absolutely any and all victims. But the perpetrators? Heck no, not welcome. A few weeks before we launched the table, word was starting to get around about our like little church plant. And so I received a call from someone who kind of a friend of a friend who had heard about it and was interested in kind of connecting with the church, once we launched, or at least potentially. But first she wanted to like get lunch and ask me a few questions. So we met in Plano, and from the beginning it was clear, like she was very strongly left in her theology and her politics. And, so there was like a lot of aspects of the table that she liked, like women in leadership and LGBTQ affirming and so on. But then she said, Brett, I like the table's values and theology and what you're sharing here. I do need to ask though, how will you keep this a safe space? And I said, I think I know what you mean, but what do you mean? And she said, well, how will you ensure that conservatives don't attend? And I remember my jaw almost hit the floor because I was like, oh my. Like, all I could think of was fundamentalist churches that do the same thing just in reverse. And I thought, is this what we've become? Just like Pharisees, but from the other direction? And I don't remember my exact words in response, but it was something to the effect of like, look, we're Christians. Like, we believe in the God who is love and like table fellowship and hospitality and all this. So like when we say all are welcome, we gotta like mean that. And frankly, as long as someone's like, respectful and considerate of others, people may disagree or whatever, but we're not going to start like kicking people out. So all to say, like, yeah, Jesus' teaching here to extend hospitality to all, it pushes us, conservative, progressive, all of us, into the complexity of what it means to love and welcome both victim and perpetrator alike. Now, having said that, I'll add, though, the moral conundrum of loving perpetrators. That's not our only challenge when practicing radical hospitality. Far from it. So that leads to our second point. The truth is that gaps of ethnicity, religion, culture, class, politics, moral standing, and really just our pace of living all kind of keep us mostly distant from others in all but the most superficial of ways. My friend Mike Nagel, he recently moved to Europe. And because of this, he's like a big book reader and he's a writer. And so he can't take all these books to Europe. So he needed to like unload his books. So at a recent friend gathering, he like literally brought a book or two for like every person there. And when he handed them out, he was clear. He said, you don't have to feel pressure to read this. If you don't want it, that's fine. Like, give it away or get rid of it, whatever. But I think you may like it. When I came across it, I thought this might be a book for you. So he gave me a few, but one of them was titled Limonov, The Outrageous Adventures of the Radical Soviet Poet Who Became a Bum in New York, a Sensation in France, and a Political Anti-Hero in Russia. And I must admit, I read it. It was one of the strangest books I've ever read. I can't say I recommend it. Edward Limonov was not a good person. He eventually became just like an outright fascist. He's like morally, gross. But I'll say he does have his insights. And one of them was an observation he made about his time in America, where he was at that time living on the streets, as the title, Bum in New York and such, kind of indicates. He was living on the streets. At that time, he was thinking of becoming a radical leftist. Just his personality. He was going to be really radical one way or the other, either left or right. So at this time, he's leaning left. So he attends some kind of Marxist meetings and such. It was the 70s, I think. And he liked their talk, overthrowing the rich and helping the downcast and such. But then after attending a few of these, he noticed there were no poor people at the meetings. And not even just working class. And in fact, none of the people in the meetings themselves had ever been poor. And furthermore, he said they seemed to actually be a bit afraid of the streets and the sections of town where people in poverty were living, including him. So at one point he suggested, he's like, we've been talking a lot. Maybe we should do something. Now it's Lemonov. He was very crazy. So he suggests, he's like, let's do something revolutionary, start a fire, hijack a plane, or, something. And they're like, no thanks. But Edward, we'll see you at 4 p.m. next week. And then as he describes the scene, he said they all left to go back to their fancy coffee shops to talk more, while I went back to my cardboard box. See, there was this kind of weird disconnect between talk and living, ideas and relationships. I was reminded of that description from Lemonov when I read this key line from our text again. Verse 5, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. See, it's easy to be a political keyboard warrior, to read the books, attend the meetings. It's different to actually meet someone, befriend them, know them, give and receive. And for it to all be deeply personal and relational. I'll close with this. I've spoken before about Dorothy Day, the co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, with their houses of hospitality that still dot the country to this day. And while she was very outspoken politically, certainly, no shrinking violet when it came to speaking truth to power and critiquing both government and the church. In fact, so much so, there's a kind of a movement to make her a saint in the Catholic Church, but she just said such harsh things at times against the church. It's kind of it's going to be tough for her to get in. But she also named, though, that she said it's easy to get kind of so focused on changing systems or influencing the government or wielding political power. She said that we start to miss the person. So she called her approach to change personalism. She said, we cannot love God unless we love each other, and to love, we must know each other. This is why, in addition to writing books and articles for the Catholic Worker and all that, they started these houses of hospitality, and it was because of this grassroots, actually connecting with people. This, it seems to me, this is a deeply, profoundly Christian idea and a deeply ethical idea. Right? It stems from Jesus. I'm coming to your house today. You come to my house today. This is a radical, profound Christian hospitality. So here's kind of my challenge for you this week. I want you to consider inviting someone to lunch, or even better, to dinner or a meal at your house that you normally would not. Maybe there's a kind of religious difference there, or ethnicity, or class, or maybe they were or are a perpetrator in some way as you see them. I want to encourage you, meet them, know them, and just see what God might do in your midst. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.